Hello, good morning, everyone. It's great to see that you've all turned up in great numbers so early on in the morning already. So thank you for that. And I also like to thank the CPDP organizers for bringing us together for the important conversation on privacy-enhanced technologies. And basically the question that's looming in the background, why would you invest in pets anyway? And that's what we're going to explore today. Let me quickly show that we'll be exploring how to bridge the gap between pets, so the government opportunities to lead on information and privacy. So pets represent one of the most promising developments in data protection, but is offering a path where innovation and privacy can truly coexist and reinforce each other. And the current landscape represents an interesting paradox. So while the private sector has made significant strides in developing and implementing pets, from differential privacy and federated learning to more cryptographic applications like secure multi-party computation, but also trusted execution environments. The widespread adoption of these technologies continues to lag behind expectations. And many organizations are facing barriers, including limited understanding of the capabilities of pets. There's also a lack of expertise to implement and maintain those. There are implementation costs involved, but there's also regulatory uncertainty. And this is why, and we're going to explore also to the question how governments can play a transformative role here. And our discussion today will focus on 4 key elements. First one is that how governments can serve as a catalyst for pet adoption through their own implementation. The strategic investments, that's the second point, need to build capacity and expertise. The third topic sees to the importance of developing interoperable standards to facilitate integration. And the fourth one will look at how smart regulatory incentives can create an environment where pets can flourish. Today we have an exceptional panel of experts representing diverse perspectives, and we'll begin with a moderated discussion exploring these 4 themes first, followed by an opportunity for you to interact. We dedicate at least 15 minutes. But let me briefly introduce our distinguished panelists. And starting with myself, I'm Rob van Eyck, working as the Managing Director for Future of Privacy Forum here in Brussels, leading the European activities. We have Avalda Baziter, and obviously Avalda, many of you know already, but if you do not, Avalda is a legal and policy officer in data protection unit of the European Commission's DG Justice and Consumers. She's responsible for monitoring the implementation of the GDPR in the member states. And as part of her tasks, she also works closely with other European Commission services. And that includes work on legislative and non-legislative initiatives under the European Strategy for Data in the area of financial services, but also in mobility. So, the fun fact about Valda is that she comes from a mushroom-picking country, and her favorite mushroom-picking spot, obviously, is private information that cannot be disclosed. Then we have, in the middle, Sarah Holland. Sarah is a member of Google's Privacy, Safety and Security Public Policy team, focusing on responsible data strategy, privacy-enhanced technologies, and sensitive data issues. She taught data ethics at Georgetown University, but also was a Berkman Klein Center Assembly Fellow, co-founding a project to enhance data analysis and AI outcomes. And previously, she served as a senior advisor in the US Senate on data, privacy, and consumer protection, where she successfully negotiated 3 bills through to enactment. Well, let's continue on this agricultural theme. The fun fact for Sarah is that her parents had a cattle farm when she was growing up, and she had to do normal chores, of course, there's much to do at the farm. But sometimes the unusual happened, and she got to help deliver 2 baby calves, which is nice, right? And then we have a dear friend of mine, Christian Rijmsbach-Konatze. He's a senior information economist and policy analyst at the OECD Data Flows Governance and Privacy Division. With over 20 years in digital transformation, he focused on data governance at the OECD since 2010. He coordinates projects on data governance for AI, particularly data access, and privacy-enhancing technologies. And previously, he researched at the Karlsruhe Institute of Technology and SAP researched and worked as an IT consultant in Luxembourg's investment banking sector. So also many aspects that are relevant for pets that have shaped your perspective over the years. So the fun thing about Christian is to encounter the frequently cited but flawed analogy of data as the new oil. Christian proposed in a 2014 OECD report that data should instead be regarded as a form of infrastructure. And currently, in his personal capacity, he is working on a philosophical paper exploring the relationship between data and love in a mystical sense. Well, looking out to read that. So, first round of discussion will be around understanding pets' barriers and benefits. And my opening question to Sarah sees two barriers to pets adoption. Sarah, you released a paper, and that's also at the booth, I understood, and also online. And in that paper, you suggest that adoption is not widespread, despite the promise and interest in pets. And can you walk through the significant barriers as you or industry sees them?
Yeah, I would be happy to. I also want to talk a little bit about the benefits as well before we get into the barriers, just to kind of start us on a positive note, and then we'll get to all the work that we have to do. We really think of pets as an AI opportunity. They're an opportunity for people, they're an opportunity for businesses, and they're an opportunity for governments. They're generally understood to be a broad suite of techniques and technologies. There's a lot of discussion about what is and isn't a use of pet, but the core message is that they enable responsible use of data to power valuable insights, products and services with privacy and security, and that's the really important part. We see this, becoming more of a hot button conversation with the rise of generative AI and a lot of the questions, the Gen AI acceleration in terms of its capabilities and its adoption is raising. And we think pets are great for baseline protections for people, and it can really protect individuals from harm and misuse, ID theft, fraud. It's good for businesses. We found that it can help grow new lines of revenue. It can help small businesses access markets, and it can help fortify trust in the digital services and techniques that are absolutely critical to our digital economy. And for governments, we've seen that with AI, that when they have been really making smart investments in AI and expressly encouraging its use, they're gaining a competitive advantage. And I think we're going to see that with pets. They're going to be better positioned to benefit from the innovation, the progress that comes from this. So we've got a nice grounding of what they are. We can talk a little bit about what they aren't later, perhaps, because I want to be really clear that our excitement is going to match a healthy skepticism about them. But the barriers we see are organizational. We think that they're due to the technology. They also can be resource-based. So let me go into a little bit of detail because I think it underscores why this is very much a collective effort. It's not just industry that can solve this. It's not just civil society or government that can solve this. We very much have to have everyone, academia included, to participate. And it helps underscore why regulatory uncertainty, I think, really comes into play here. So there's a lot of lack of understanding that we see with what pets are, what they aren't, their capabilities, their limitations across various different techniques, the use cases, how you can use a pet for the work that you have, impact on organizational critical applications. So if you're a healthcare entity, right, or billions of people are depending on your products, you want to be very certain that pets are not negatively impacting the work that you're charged to do. There could be open questions and uncertainty around how to balance privacy with other factors and goals, and we may get into that later, definitely with other policy goals. And sometimes it just takes time for technologies to get better. A really great example is multi-party computation, which has been around since the 1980s. That's quite some time ago, not to make anyone in this room feel old, but now it's riding a very promising wave. And so sometimes we just need a lot of work and time for technologies to develop. There's certainly cost. It can take time to ramp up, headcount integration, maintenance, computational power and infrastructure. It could also be organizational. How do you get started? I particularly think that this is acute for non-technology driven companies. You could have questions about how to implement in your workflows. You may not have the necessary expertise to implement correctly, and that's a very important point, that pets are not a magical solution. They're not a blank check. You actually have to use them correctly. And so helping to understand how to do that is really important. And then I think particularly important from perhaps a government and a business perspective, users, customers, contractors may not understand and trust their usage. And so that's really important when you're serving those populations. And then last, there's an opportunity cost calculation. And this is one where I think regulatory uncertainty looms quite large. And this is something very much, I think, from an industry perspective as well, is what's the return on investment? If we've talked about all the cost and all the challenges that it takes to implement pets into your workflow, how do we make that calculation better, more clear, and more compelling? And how do you do that when the benefits may be longer term and harder to quantify? So how do you enable your technical teams, your product teams, your policy teams, your legal teams to advocate for the usage of pets in kind of a broader business conversation? How do you make this a C-suite priority? And so I think those are the real key issues. And you can kind of pull this all together in this idea of really how do you select, test, and evaluate pets? And this is something that I think underscores that there's no single approach to pets, nor should there be. That both makes it more clear and important and ensures that pets are working as intended, but it also makes it really challenging for practitioners trying to implement pets. And so I do want to call out a couple of things that are really important to consider as you're thinking about pets, as you're also thinking about these barriers that I just discussed. And the first is the threat model. What are you trying to protect against? Whether that be something like re-identification or leakage. How will your data be used, including the nature, scope, context, purposes of processing? What are the data protection risks of processing under applicable laws? Whether and how pets will address the recognized data protection risks, the technical complexity of your implementation, the impact on functionality for end users or others, and then the cost and resources available. And we think once you kind of go through that factor list and you think about it, then you can kind of go forward with your use of pets. So the nuance, the technical complexity, the costs are certainly challenges, but I think those are absolutely essential to get right so that pets are working as intended and we are achieving the promise that pets afford us.
Well, thank you for opening this first round on understanding pets, barriers and benefits. I have a follow-up question to Christian on promising approaches to accelerate adoption. And the question is, what are the most promising approaches to accelerate the adoption amongst data users and technology providers, particularly given the technical complexity and uneven maturity of these technologies?
Thank you, Rob, and also thank you a lot for having me here and to talk to you and to share with you some of the insights of our work at the OECD. And I will directly want to build on what Sarah just said, by first of all highlighting that a lot of the challenges that Sarah highlighted can actually be a little bit, you could say, mapped along three vectors. And I will then basically highlight what governments can do along those three vectors. One is the issue around ensuring the availability of cost-effective pets. So Sarah, you rightly talked about the importance of having a return on investment that is positive. Obviously, that's what business executive will pay attention to. And this is where it's so important also to be able to measure the effectiveness. So benchmarking is definitely an area where we see a need to foster more progress, because it's true that if you cannot measure how effectiveness pets are, it will be very hard to justify what the return on investment will be and whether it will be positive given how costly pets are. The second point, which is exactly still an issue, is that in many instances pets are relatively expensive for what they promise, what they can deliver. Sarah, you highlighted the example of multi-party computation, and it's true that progress has happened in that field. The same can be said, for instance, for homomorphic encryption, which has been relatively expensive, remains relatively expensive, but it's getting better and better. And this is where definitely there is a need also for government to support research and development. And we have seen some governments do so with specific funding dedicated to that. So this is basically that factor about ensuring the availability of cost-effective pets, where definitely more efforts are required. The second vector is essentially ensuring competitive markets, which is essentially obviously competition we know is a way to reduce the cost of technology. And when you have competition in the area of privacy-enhancing technologies, this is a way to drive costs down. And obviously, if there is support by governments to support R&D, it all contributes to that. But another important element is that it's important for the users to understand that the use of privacy-enhancing technology is a competitive advantage in itself. And this is obviously where, on one hand, it's tied to also the recognition that privacy is a competitive feature, which, depending on the sector, you may see that less or more. But the other element, and I think this is also important when we talk about privacy-enhancing technology to recognize, is that the benefits of pets is not only limited to privacy and certainly not limited to privacy compliance. I think, Sarah, you highlighted that. I think it's good to recall that a lot of use cases that we have seen are also about protecting or enabling the sharing of data, also non-personal data, and ensuring that, for instance, intellectual property right, trade secrets are also protected. Why is it important? I think it's also important because as, for instance, let's say the CIO of a company wants to basically make the argument why they should invest in privacy-enhancing technology, it's not enough to just say, we are going to reduce our compliance costs. I mean, that's not the most appealing way to sell the technology. In many instances, what you may want to say also is like, what will basically the revenue and at the end the profit margin how will it increase based on the investment in privacy enhancing technology? So going to the argument of return on investment. And the last point, or maybe what can governments do in that respect, is essentially to raise awareness of use cases that are essentially providing value added to businesses, but also to society at large and also to governments. And this is basically also an area where we are putting some efforts at the OECD to essentially establish a repository of use cases that promise to generate value for society, for businesses and individuals. And the last point I want to briefly touch on is skills and awareness. This is definitely something that we have heard also a lot of privacy-enhancing technology providers complain about, is that people still don't understand what pets are and certainly don't understand what are the most promising use cases. So a lot of vendors are spending a lot of time to convince and explain and educate the potential clients why they should, what are pets, as Sarah highlighted, and what are the benefits of pets. And I think we as a society at large, but also governments, have quite some opportunities to educate and raise awareness about the benefits. And I would just also add not only the governments, but not only governments, but also the regulators have a role, obviously, to play in raising awareness.
Thank you, Christian. So taking it one step further from use cases to actual building blocks that are out there, obviously on the web there are many open source libraries, but there are critical components like building blocks that may actually possibly have to come from public institutions or governments. So let me turn this question to Valda. Are there any tools currently developed, for instance, by the Commission to help adopt pets?
Thank you for this question. Indeed, they are. I think just not to keep my answer too short, we have this amazing project of eIDAS that has entered the second stage of developing e-wallets. We are very excited about that it will give a little bit more control to the citizens and simply residents of EU who have access to e-governance systems in their member states to have their electronic identity and documents in one space and in a protected way. And of course, the EU wallets have very different use cases. But as part of this discussion, we relatively recently also connected it to another discussion what we had, namely how to protect children online. We all have heard about various age verification solutions, But I think we all agree that now the debate has been reactivated because of all the terrible stuff that we hear is happening to teenagers online. Unfortunately, that is the case, and we cannot get away of that. And we, as public sector, has to come and see how we can help to prevent the negative consequences of these children. So here we are back into a conversation about DSA and the obligation to protect children's safety, security, and privacy, and also conversation about how to ensure that only mature children access certain content, and maybe children don't access any content. And we are back in a conversation of age verification. This is not a new conversation, as you know, but it is very important conversation to have it now. So here we, on the Commission side, started looking at it and thinking how we can assist a little bit the member states on driving forward the implementation of the tools that are in development, and possibly providing for a white label that they can plug in their national systems. And here we are currently, I don't know how many of you have been consulted or seen the public consultation. We have had the e-consent going on for a while, but now we have a latest technological specification also on GitHub about the tools that we see could help ensure that there is a safe, privacy-friendly age verification tool, because we hear a lot of worries about age verification. I myself, I work for the GDPR unit, so I am very much aware of the conversation about intrusiveness and what does it actually mean knowing how old a child is online. And to kind of get ahead of this, we are looking at developing specification that I don't want to promise zero knowledge proof, but as close as possible as we can get to zero knowledge proof. And while there is a trusted partner in between, that is the governmental provider of eIDAS infrastructure, that we know that it's a technology that only allows the service provider to know yes, no about certain age, about 18, about 13, and that this data is only used to allow children to access certain sites, and that nobody really knows on the service provider side who access where, and this linkability and tracing can be prevented. So this is our project where we chip in and trying to advance and promote and bring in the discussion. And of course, as in eIDAS, this is only one of the tools that can be used. This doesn't prevent any further development from industry, but we do believe that there needs to be one source where there is trust and comfort by the residents and citizens to use it in their interactions online.
Yeah, thank you. So one of the issues that I challenged the panelists in our preparation with is, because we have an audience of practitioners here, and some of you have a technical background, to also show that there are building blocks out there already, like libraries, but also on like GitHub repositories, such that you can also start using these tools and building blocks and example use cases, and to basically understand, okay, and this is the bridging question, how might these tools and libraries and approaches specifically build user trust? So before we move to the next round of conversation, I would love to have a quick response of each of you. I'll start with Christian. Basically around the question of building trust and the availability or the open source availability of these key building blocks, because the alternative would be you have to trust your platform, or is it also possible? Do we as a society actually need critical building blocks like age verification libraries offered by our governments, or maybe on a European level? Maybe you share some thoughts on that, please.
Happy to do that quickly. First of all, to really confirm that trust, and in particular trust in privacy-enhancing technologies, is a critical element. And I remember having participated in an event, like I think it was 2 years ago at the CNIL, where there was a gentleman basically raising the question or the concern that, in particular when it comes to privacy-enhancing technologies, we have to make sure, for instance, that they do not have any backdoors implemented in them. And so you could make the argument that, yes, providing the technology as an open source is one way how to ensure that there are no backdoors, even though we have cases where that's not necessarily a guarantee that there may not be, let's say, backdoors or any kind of security flaw, but definitely an aspect to that. I think another element to that is certification. But obviously, when you talk about certification, you introduce transaction costs because somebody needs to pay for the certification to happen. But again, I think these are all valid approaches to ensure trust. Now, you asked specifically about the government. I mean, how can I say? Obviously, when it comes to backdoors, I think we have conversation in other areas where governments have a, let's say, controversial role, have played a controversial role. So it really depends also what mechanisms have been put in place to ensure that also governments do respect, let's say, the integrity of the tools that we are talking about.
Sarah, a brief comment from you.
Yeah, I'll try to keep it brief. I think that that's critically important is contributing to open source systems, whether that's making government research available, incentivizing the research that it funds to be made available, data sets where relevant and where protected. I think also contributions to code source libraries. That's something that Google takes very seriously. We've made long-term investments in this area, significant investments in this area, and we share a lot of what we know. It's almost hard to keep up with everything we post on our research blogs, on archive, on GitHub and code repositories, but it's incredibly important. I think the other thing is it's not just putting the research and the code out there, it's also really helping people understand how to experiment with it and how to use it. And so 2 examples of what we've done is we launched the first machine learning unlearning challenge to really kind of help advance an exciting but very nascent idea of machine unlearning, which we think is going to be an important research area in the context of generative AI. We've also released a practical guide to machine learning with differential privacy, and regularly at research and academic conferences, we're running tutorials on things like machine learning and differential privacy. So it's not enough to just put the tools out there. I think you also have to help the community understand it, the constraints, the limitations, how to use it. Regulatory sandboxes may be an interesting place here for governments to take action because it enables experimentation with oversight. It builds this common understanding of between industry and government, and hopefully with civil society as well, of what the limitations are, potential mitigations, and so that common understanding is so important. And I think you'll hear that as a subtext, if not full text, in this conversation. I think it's also helping funding the research and skill building. So governments could open centers of excellence, they could create task forces. They already invest in education and skill building. Doubling down, encouraging pets to be a part of that is really going to help make sure that we have a more capable and a larger pool of people to kind of work on. It's also really important for governments to continue to invest in fundamental research. I don't know that anyone in this room would agree that it should solely be the private sector that's funding this. There's no guarantee that the private sector will open source what they know. Like I said, it's very important to Google and will continue to do that, but there's very much a role for government to continue to do that. We very much stand on the shoulders of research from government. All of us do. The internet itself was help-funded by government research. So I think that's incredibly important. I would also say one last thing is government should designate priority areas. This could be things like healthcare or national security that are uniquely important for governments to deliver and maybe less applicable for private sector research. And so doing that, either signaling that as an area to invest in or to bring collaboration with private sector and academia and civil society, I think will really help understand what open source tools or proprietary tools can mean for these different kind of sectors. So hopefully, I think biometrics and ID verification is going to be a great area for standards for certification, so hopefully we can continue to progress on that.
Yeah, which angle to tackle? Maybe let's try to bring it back to the example I gave, because I think Google is one of those companies who have to be active in different jurisdictions. I can only speak about the jurisdiction I represent, which is the European Union jurisdiction, where we love our regulation, right? And our regulation also shapes pets. I think there are two things. In general, of course, the GDPR has embedded pets in itself, in the data protection by design and by default. That's I think I found a paper published by European Commission in 2009 about strategy of pets. So, and there we were talking as pets as key building blocks for data protection, and then we developed this beautiful Article 25 in the GDPR, and we have seen it a lot from this regulatory perspective, that obviously this will be the response of the industry in order to comply the rules that we have, or to help them to comply with the rules. But then, of course, in reality, there is way much more, as our own projects shows. Now we have very regulated rules on eIDAS infrastructure, so there is very different ways how member states can provide you the electronic identification systems, but nevertheless, we as a Commission decided to put these technical specifications out, even though they will be tested by different member states, but also put it out for you, people sitting here, to have a look and see what can be done with it. I think this is, we're moving more and more in this dialogue between experts and governments, and strengthening the systems, promoting also open source, and as a way of showing trust. And that's where we, again, try to lead, not exactly lead, but at least chip in and show that we can also do that with our projects. But yeah, of course, there's a lot of discussion right now about access to funding. We have our research projects, but also very much streamlining and helping our European business. Sorry, I have to put it all there in this conversation. So I think we will have many exciting things still coming our way.
Okay, this concludes like the first round, and I'd like to, in the second round, have a little bit more focus on the regulatory frameworks and governance. And I'll start with a question for Valda, because you've addressed the GDPR and the Article 25. We've not really touched on the Article 4 discussion, whether pets can lead to anonymity or anonymous data. But taking it one step further, what's the role of pets in the EU strategy about data? To just make sure we position it a little bit in the policy development.
I think now we have I am few days before Commission will have a new public consultation on data union. So once that out, we can have completely different conversation probably. But right now, building up to that, data union and data single market is not something new. That's something that we have been building, well, at least 10 to 15 years. We have been having different strategies, and GDPR has been a very important part of this strategy. We are, as you said, I mentioned already the GDPR, where we touched upon the Article 25. But in last 5 years, when we were building acts like Data Act, like Data Governance Act, where we had PIMS as one of the elements that were officially introduced, where we had data altruism trusts as elements that could be regulated. We very much, in parallel, were thinking, okay, how can we make sure that people actually go for it and actually share the data? Because we often hear, oh, GDPR, you cannot share the data. It's like, okay. And I was like, show me where in the GDPR you have sentence that says you cannot share the data. Of course, it needs to be in a GDPR compliant way, but therefore we also needed to find a ecosystem that allows for this trusted sharing. And in that whole story, pets play a crucial role. And you mentioned anonymization. Anonymization is very important, and anonymization is very contested debate. There are different opinions out there. What is anonymous data? What is not anonymous data? There is the legal argument. There's a technical argument. There's a court ruling pending that everybody awaits. The Commission's opinion on this is very clear. We think that recital 26 of the GDPR is clear. You have to look at what the companies can actually do in terms of re-identifying the data. And then, of course, and this brings us back to pets, what are the technology? Is it scalable? Is it something that everybody has access or only Sarah has access to? I think this is a very important thing when we think about the data strategy, because it all kind of comes together in this. And just to finish up, the data strategy continues, data union continues, the streamlining and sharing the data continues. And I think the more scalable the pets become, the easier is also for the market.
Well, thank you for your candid reflections on the role of pets in the EU strategy for data. I'm now moving to Christian for a question on the convergence across privacy frameworks and borders. And the question is, how can we foster greater convergence on the role of pets in privacy and data governance frameworks, as pets have increasing potential across sectors and borders?
Yes. So essentially, at the OECD, the way we want to approach this, or what we have recognized as a key kind of requirement, is to essentially put everyone on the same page. And to basically raise awareness and make sure that all the countries, all the regulators, all the policymakers, but also stakeholders more broadly, are aware about the limitation and potential of privacy-enhancing technologies. And this is one of the key reasons why we have decided, together with obviously with the member countries, to work towards a repository of use cases, a global repository of use cases. Now, in order maybe to explain why such a repository could be useful for achieving a kind of a convergence in how we understand and treat pets in data governance, but also privacy frameworks, I would like maybe to ask in the room, how many of the people here are legal professionals? If you could raise your hands.
That's quite a number. Yeah.
It's quite a number of people. So all of you who have raised your hands are probably familiar, obviously, with the importance of legal cases as a basis for education, as a basis for basically communication between the different stakeholders in the legal system. Because that's a common kind of reference point for argumentation, but also for essentially building a consensus around how to deal with those specific legal cases. And in the same way, we think that having a global repository of use cases for pets can essentially also help the different professionals, from legal professionals to technical professional policymakers, essentially get to some kind of consensus about how to deal with privacy-enhancing technologies in different legislation. Now, this doesn't mean that we will automatically have a consensus, but at least we will have a common reference point that we can use for dialogue, because currently this is not existent. Currently, when you talk about privacy-enhancing technologies, it really comes down to the likelihood of you getting access or having encountered a specific use case, and then we will always have kind of a risk of miscommunication, because people tend to talk about different types of use cases. Even if they are talking about the same technologies, they may not talk about the same implementation of the technology, and that's why at the OECD we thought that we may need to have this kind of common reference so that people can refer to the specific case X when talking, and then when building a consensus position about how to regulate or not the specific use of pets in that particular use case.
With the risk of over-asking, you talked a lot about repository of use cases. Is there like one example we can make this a little bit more tangible for the audience that comes to your mind? A use case that helps?
I mean, I can give you, in the risk of being a little bit more complex, because use case, you have, for instance, a use case where you have multiple actors that are trying to essentially identify common users in their user base, but they don't necessarily want to share, obviously, the database, but they want to know who is a potential common customers of all of us so we know areas where we can collaborate. This is sometimes a relevant area in the area of marketing, where you have, let's say, transportation companies, including air flight operators, but also hotels, basically trying to optimize their services. They don't necessarily want to share, obviously, who is a specific customer X that is also your customer, but they want to know among the customers that I have, who are those that are relevant for this kind of joint operation, so that they can essentially have a sense of how to treat those specific customers. The reason why I'm pointing to that example is because you will see a similarity to another area where, for instance, in healthcare, you have different hospitals trying to identify common patients without the need to share who those patients are, but they will use the similar techniques. Multi-party computation is one of them that is used in both areas. So the way we have dealt with that is essentially to formulate what we call use case archetypes. So the use case would be trying to find common customers in a specific, let's say, marketing context, or another use case would be health. But the archetype would be essentially the abstraction of that, try to find a common base across distributed data sets. And in doing that, and then looking into what type of different privacy-enhancing technologies are used, what are the cost benefits, risks that are eventually remaining when you use different types of pets, we think that in doing so, we can basically have a consensus discussion around the benefits, risk, and also have eventually, in the long run, a common regulatory position of regulators eventually about how to deal with that.
Thank you. I think it's slowly becoming clear that the use cases that you're talking about are not just an architectural problem, but it's how do we combine these building blocks in order to bridge the gap towards like the legal requirements and the legal interpretation of what you're trying to build and protect.
And if I may just also complement, the important point is also that those use cases and use case archetypes are those that actually also demonstrate the value. It's not about some kind of abstract data processing activity. It's usually one that you will be able to communicate to your CEO and say, there is benefit in doing that, but obviously we need to take the necessary precautionary measures to protect privacy, intellectual property rights, and so on.
One example, just to add to Christian's, that I think is one of my favorites, because it's an example, we talk about the cost of pets, that is very much a challenge, but pets can also help you save money. And let me just kind of, it blew my mind, but we worked with Swift, the Google Cloud worked with Swift, which is if you're not familiar, they're the global provider of secure financial messaging services. So it allows banks to talk to each other, right? And I think we all have probably, has anyone received like a scammy text lately asking for like something with your banking information? Just 2 of you? That's a lie. There's gotta be more. Right, so the banking, like fraud and asking for like your banking details is a big problem, right? And it costs individuals money, it can cost you greater harms than that, it costs banks money, it costs governments money. Multi-million-dollar, could even be a national security risk. So we partnered with Swift and a couple of other providers to develop anti-fraud technologies, because previously these institutions involved in Swift couldn't share data across each other. So Valda and Christian and I all use different banking entities, but I'm transacting with them, giving them money. My bank may know that something is scammy, but Christian's bank may not. And there's a lot of sensitive data in that, whether that be for privacy reasons, for business confidentiality reasons. And so these techniques and technologies are enabling those banks to share that information across each other to kind of close the gap on vulnerabilities that malicious actors were doing a very good job of exploiting. And they're doing that with privacy and security. So that is a great example of people having different data sets that are wanting to get insights across those 2 different data sets, not wanting to actually share that information together and not needing to share that information together, but still getting all these benefits and saving millions of dollars and hopefully saving you some like really annoying text messages along the way. So that's just one very practical, concrete one. And that one's also really interesting because the financial world is heavily regulated. And so that just kind of shows that there needs to be cooperation, not just with your privacy regulators, you need a whole of government approach because that obviously touches your financial regulators as well. So just wanted to add that one example.
Yeah, now I also have like a follow-up question, and this feeds into the synthesis question, where do you see the most promising areas for regulatory alignment around pets? So if that's the background, the question becomes, what role do you see for multi-stakeholder collaboration, particularly governments, given their unique role in meeting these challenges?
So much opportunity, so much opportunity. We outline a lot of this in the paper. I encourage you to read it. It's available in print and digital at the booth if you just go out the door to your left. It's also online. But I think it's hugely important. I think there's some fantastic organizations working in this space. Christian's obviously, Rob's obviously, also CIPL, and a lot of governments are working together, I think, directly to try to tackle this problem too, because we see a global interest in pets, but also kind of some questions of like, how do we actually move this forward at a really kind of more detailed, practical level? So I think participating in those international fora is very important. If Christian invites you to his event, show up, participate, help contribute to the case studies. If Valda calls you in and asks you, talk to us about pets and how this works, show up, participate, give that information to those consultations, and really hopefully encouraging governments to work across the divide. I know that there's going to be a lot of activity with the G7 DPA summit coming up. I'm hopeful that pets are going to be a big conversation at Global Privacy Assembly, where privacy regulators gather annually. I know FPF runs a DPA Pets Network. Participate in that if you're a DPA. Encourage your DPA to participate in that, because I think that's going to be really important for the international standards, for the benchmarking, for the codes of conduct. I know that there's talk about cross-border regulatory sandboxes, which I think will be really important. But the most important, and I've got to say this, and this may be unique to the industry perspective, but we've talked a lot about regulatory uncertainty, but we haven't said what exactly that is or how we can solve that. So I want to spend some time talking about that, because that is very key to the ROI calculation, but also just really helping ensure that we are matching, that we're guarding against privacy washing. We haven't talked about that yet, but it's worth remembering that our excitement should match our kind of clear-eyed thinking on this. So these regulatory incentives, in addition to the cross-border collaboration, in addition to funding, in addition to the standards and guidelines, there's 3 clear things that governments can do, privacy regulators can do, that will be strong incentives for businesses across the private sector to invest in pets. The first one is the tiered approach to identifiability of data. This is reflected in every privacy framework around the world, right? The more identifying the data, the more sensitive data, the more protections that follow it. It's very logical. That makes a lot of sense. It works. And in that, I think there's 2 things to highlight. One, have a strong but practical definition of anonymization. Let's not chase the theoretical. Let's really think about what we have today and guard against that while we continue to develop our techniques. So really nice, clear definitions of anonymization that give flexibility so that you can scalably match and continue to adapt the techniques that you have to your use case. And that helps us keep up with privacy and security risks that evolve, new vulnerabilities that evolved, new modalities. We weren't talking about Gen AI at CPDP maybe 6 years ago. We definitely are talking about it now. And so keeping pace with everything, new products, new techniques, new ecosystem players, et cetera. So strong and workable, but keeping pace with technology. The second one is there's no really clear incentive when it comes to privacy protective sharing. So Christian and I both talked about different case studies where you may not want to, or you may not be able to reduce the identifiability of data. So you don't want actually anonymization in that use case, but you're reducing the risk to the user from the processing because you're restricting the sharing. And we really want to think about what real clear compliance benefits are from using that, whether it's secure multi-party computation, whether that's trusted execution environments, which is so hot right now. A lot of people are investing in TEEs across the ecosystem. And so I really think that we want to think about how do we actually put a really clear incentive on privacy protective sharing. I think that's going to be really important in the enterprise and cloud world. That's going to be really important in ads world. I think in healthcare research, that's going to be really exciting. The sky's the limit there. The second one is guidance to expressly indicate the use of pets as a compelling factor in a legitimate interest balancing test. So legitimate interest is a legal basis of processing in many frameworks around the world. Obviously here in Europe it is. And I think really talking about where pets fit into the balancing test and showing that it is a very clear, compelling factor will really encourage companies to look into that and try to use that wherever possible. So I think that it really strengthens that as a concept. And then if you do that and you document it in your risk assessments, your data protection impact assessments, it allows your regulator to check your work. So it's fortifying legitimate interest, but it's doing it with strong accountability. And we think that that's really gonna, be important. There's also, I think, something to be said for data subject rights, but I don't want to go on and on. Again, go read the paper. I'll do a shameless plug there for that again. And then the third one is help governments to help identify specific risks to privacy. Obviously, companies should be doing this themselves, but governments very much should be doing that. Setting expectations around the recommended risk thresholds, which is really important, and providing guidance on applications or appropriate protections rather than prescribing a specific technique. Because if there's one of many takeaways that you should have from this panel is there is no single approach to pets, nor should there be. You need to match the right pet or combination of pets for the right context, the right use case, the right risk, the right legal obligation, the processing that you're doing, et cetera. And so really having a lot more information from governments on that, on those factors will be important, as long as it's not tied to a specific technique, because we want to continue to supercharge all of the techniques that we've talked about and the ones that are just now kind of on the horizon. So again, identifiability of data, making pets a compelling factor in legitimate interest balancing test, and making that very clear and explicit. And then the third one, providing a lot more information about risks and appropriate risk thresholds.
Well, thank you for these reflections, and obviously some of those reflections could be perceived as a little bit more provocative, but that also shows that due to the acceleration of the developments in our society and the innovations in technology, it is important to touch upon concepts that we may have linked to definitions, and whether those definitions may have changed against the background of how our society is changing. So I think this is a topic we'll hear more about in the near future. I'd love to move to the third part of this panel, which is all about moving to action. And also, in order to balance speaking time fairly, I would like to suggest to change the order slightly. Valda first, and then Christian, and then Sarah. So I like three words that really resonate with me. The first one was privacy protective data sharing. We've also heard about privacy preserving machine learning. There's privacy enhanced technologies. And somehow all these concepts overlap or intersect. So the moving to action question to Valda is, how might the Commission's work serve as a model for other governments in terms of moving trust and adoption of pets into the right direction?
Well, I think on a global level, we know of Brussels spillover effect. So we know that this happened with the GDPR. We do hope that our practical work also now on age verification can be served as a global standard, the same way as COVID certificates did, by the way. Maybe not exactly privacy enhancing technology there, but we developed infrastructure that allowed for very minimal data sharing, almost no tracing of, actually no tracing, not almost no tracing of people, notifications based on Bluetooth. And what we saw that in the midst of pandemia, governments across the globe started using our infrastructure because they said, well, we cannot come up with anything better. And we had to keep on having the infrastructure running way after we stopped using it in EU. So that is a positive thing that we saw. And we do hope that also in this discussion about age verification, where we're going, where we can strive for zero knowledge proof, this will also be seen as a standard. And I will keep it there.
Okay, Christian, for you, a little bit more of an economic question. What specific type of investments would most accelerate the adoption of pets?
Thank you for the question. I would say number one is probably skills and awareness. And that includes not only raising skills, let's say, within the education system, but I would in particular recommend targeting SMEs. Because this is probably, I mean, we know that SMEs are, in terms of their contribution to the economy, the most prevalent, the most numbered actors in the economy. But at the same time, they are the one that probably don't necessarily have the resources to spend in experimenting with privacy-enhancing technologies. And so I would definitely see, if I had to pick one specific targeted measure, it would be to raise awareness and among SMEs, and together probably with standardization activities. Because standards are definitely a way how you can implement certain standardized practices, including on privacy-enhancing technologies, and disseminate that in a way that is cost-effective, to be brief.
Okay, Sarah, this is a question on actionable steps for policy professionals, like we see here in the audience. For the policy and legal professional in this room looking for practical ways to advance pets within their own organizations, what are 2 or 3 specific actionable steps they could advocate for or implement in near term, combining both the leading by example approach and the development of conducive policies?
I think the first one would be advocating with governments and regulators around the world to create incentives for pets. I talked about regulatory incentives. I'm happy to kind of reinforce those for you all. Those are really, really, really important. One we didn't talk about is government should be using pets themselves. So advocating for pets usage. One, that's good because governments collect and process a lot of data. I think that it's really important to ensure that that data is kept private and secure. And also government use can send a very strong signal to the private sector that pets are worth investing in. The second thing to advocate for within government usage is, in addition to the signaling, is to encourage incentives in procurement and contracting. So governments have the power of the purse, really signaling that pets need to be a part of any contract that they implement, whether that's with a cloud provider or other entity. That makes it, to Christian's earlier point about being able to compete on pets to have the best possible suite of offerings of pets, that is a fantastic way to unleash that and really encourage those providers to do that. It can also help short circuit the time as governments may need to build capacity to implement pets themselves on their own workflows. So consider it from the contracting perspective. And then I think the third one is to, within your own organization, have a really strong criteria and framework for how you're selecting, testing, and evaluating pets. Again, you want pets to work as intended. You want them to match the purpose for which you're picking them. And so having a really strong framework for that goes through all the challenges that we talked to, the important factors. I will flag that Google will have a technical paper coming soon, maybe next month or in the coming weeks, to talk about our guidance to practitioners for how we do our selection, testing, and evaluation, and really pushing back on the idea that privacy and utility are a zero sum. For so long, that was this old chestnut in pets conversations, is that you had to have one or the other. You can have your cake and you can have it and you can eat it too. And that's a really exciting world that we want to live in. So figuring out how you can kind of push back on that zero sum and having a strong framework, because we don't want a lot of misuse, whether that's intentional or not, to come from pets. I think that's going to stymie the efforts that all of us are working on and the investments that we're all working on. So that criteria will be really important. So your own evaluation criteria, advocating, we would love for you to advocate for the regulatory incentives we think that are really important, but 3, also advocating for governments to use pets themselves. There's no greater signal, there's no greater convening power than the government, so we think that's going to be a really important step to take.
So it's remarkable, we're really on time in terms of our planned schedule. We did plan 15 minutes to interact with you and the audience. We've been talking for a long time. And I just want to make sure that you also have the opportunity to speak. So I already see a question there, and please go ahead.
Hello, I'm Thiago Moraes from the Brazilian DPA. And first of all, gives a thumbs up to what Sarah just said, that the FPF network on pets is really amazing. Just this week, we had this discussion on NIST and ICO guidelines and approach to pets, and every month when we have discussions, it's really beneficial. What I wanted to ask, and I'll leave as an open question so any of you could answer, I was curious to know how each of your institutions are addressing the tensions that we have with pets when we are considering the value that pets usually is looking for, which is privacy, but in the AI context, we also have like fairness, transparency, that not every time comes in hands to hands with privacy. And for example, the FACT community, which is quite active, has been researching a lot on that, right? Like how, for example, federated learning and differential privacy needs to be structured in a certain way for you to avoid, for example, issues with fairness indicators like statistical parity. So yeah, I was just curious if there's also work in development. Last year I talked very briefly with Lucia Russo from OECD, and we had some discussion, but I was curious if there's like developments in any of your backgrounds. Thanks.
Thank you, Thiago. Christian first, maybe?
No, I'm happy to start, and I would probably first answer by highlighting that we should be also careful not to expect too much from privacy-enhancing technologies. Obviously, they are not like the super tool that's going to solve all the problems that we see in terms of regulatory challenges. And so fairness, I wouldn't necessarily point to privacy-enhancing those tools that we're talking about in terms of solving that particular problem. But it's true that when you want to solve, I mean, if you have to address some of the challenges related to biases and so on, obviously, while you are implementing your pet solution, you need to address that as well. But it's not that specific tool, at least from the use case we have seen, that is the most suitable and that it will address that. Having said that, I think in the most recent report that we will publish next month, which is focusing on pets and AI, actually shows that yes, privacy-enhancing technologies have a big role to play when it comes to privacy-preserving machine learning and some of the deployment or trustworthy AI deployment, but really in areas where the protection of privacy is key to that, or the protection of intellectual property right as well.
I think it's a fantastic question. I thank you for asking it. I think that's really important in terms of the risk threshold that I talked about earlier, because when we talked about risk threshold, it's not just in terms of privacy or security. You have to think about these other obligations you have: transparency, fairness, and then Christian mentioned intellectual property. You could talk about competition. If you had other kind of regulatory obligations, obviously the field expands there. So I hope that continues to be a conversation that we all have with governments like yours as well, to understand where that threshold should be set. Are there certain use cases or certain processing where you may need to prioritize fairness, for example, a little bit higher because of the implications, or you want to do privacy a little bit higher for the implications? And so where to kind of like set that, because then that gives a strong signal to a practitioner of, well, what technique or combination of techniques, and I do want to emphasize that techniques can be combined. That is very common, that yields comprehensive protection. That is a good thing. And so what techniques or field of techniques are going to be able to get you there to what you've set out as the threshold? I will mention again the paper that we have coming out. So if you needed to add to your reading list, maybe I should plug Notebook LM. You could put this all in there and turn it into a podcast and listen to all these papers that we're pushing out on your commute. But that paper is going to set out how we kind of consider that in our criteria and how we select that. So if you'd like to follow up with me afterwards, I will be happy to send you a link to that paper when it's out. But I think that's really important. That adds to the complexity of pets, but that ensures that we're getting right, because we're not we're not living in a vacuum here just at a privacy conference. This is very kind of comprehensive, and we want to make sure we're delivering a great experience, that we're meeting all of our obligations, even when those sometimes appear to be at tension with each other.
Just to bring it back to the continent on which we are right now, I think we are very lucky the GDPR has included fairness and transparency as one of the key principles. And we always consider the processing of personal data needs to be not only privacy protecting, but also fair and transparent. And for us, of course, under our regulatory regime, we do not distinguish pets as such. We just see them as our technical measures to ensure data protection. And therefore, I will agree a little bit with Sarah here, saying that, well, it really you have obligation under GDPR to use the most appropriate technical measures in the light of the purpose of the processing. So you have to see which of the privacy enhancing technologies to use in a way that it is still transparent and fair under the GDPR and transparent and fair for development of AI.
Let me add that I mean, as a computer scientist, I see much development in terms of the quantification of risks, but also the quantification of the effectiveness of the PATS tools. And one of the things you picked up this week, Tiago, is about the NIST guidelines, which actually lay out quite a number of metrics that can be applied, for instance, to measure information leakage in trained models or membership inference if you have left different types of attacks. And NIST has built up a repository of over 50 types of attacks in order to test and quantify whether a trained model is fit for purpose to be deployed for a specific purpose in a specific context. So in terms of that move to action, like the third round of the discussion we had today, I think the next step in discussion is going to also be about how to close the discussion about what is the threshold for reasonable, what is the threshold for any of the principles in Article 5 of the GDPR. Because in terms of legal certainty, if you're an SME or you're a startup and you're designing a new innovative solution for the market, you need to have a little bit of comfort in terms of configuring your privacy by design data flow. So this is how I want to connect the call to action with, okay, but how do you know that you're on the right path? And when is enough enough? Because obviously resources specifically for SMEs are not unlimited. So at some point you have to say, okay, this is the risk that we have identified. And these are the measures that we've implemented, technically organizational measures and contractual measures. But there will also be residual risks that you need to take into account in order to do business, because business is also about taking risk economically, but also in terms of enforcement risk exposure. So I hope that we will move towards quantification of risks at some point as well, and not end up in the situation where we, for instance, EDPB may take or continue to take the position of, in order to arrive at an insignificant level of risk, because that's moving away from the added value of what PATS can have in terms of pragmatic implementations to a more legal binary view of, okay, PATS have no added value because it will never render your data anonymous. So this is a type of discussion which we see developing. I'm positive and pragmatic in terms of contribution to the discussion, because I think what the computer science community has to offer has grown over the last 15 years. There's so many building blocks in the toolkit of privacy-enhanced technologies. We're now able to measure the effect of different types of attacks to data in terms of re-identification risks. But what does this mean if you look at it through a policy lens? So thank you for that question, Tiago. I see another question there, please.
I'm Alexandria Stanford from Tilburg University. My research is regarding pets, and I have a question regarding pets as a way for Europe to extend or to help with its data sovereignty. It is a technical measure. I'm wondering, with the geopolitical climate, do you think that the adoption of certain pets can be a point of contention? For example, the EU DI wallet that uses zero knowledge proof and attributes and all of these different things. For example, as a European resident citizen that travels abroad and we're using these pets, do you think that on the international stage that, you know, there could be, that some companies could be a little bit hesitant in adopting some pets?
We still have minutes. This is just the bell to make sure Valda keeps it brief.
No, but I think, thank you for the question. Our first obligation is towards our citizens, towards our residents, towards people who live in the European Union. While developing this EU IDAS infrastructure that we already have in place and now enhancing it, our first task is to ensure that when people interact with EU governments, it is in a safe, secure, and privacy-friendly way. That there's really no risk to digitalization, and the efficiency of governments increase by saving money, by ensuring. So we wouldn't see that as any type of, I don't know, tariff, whatever, words floating around, whatever EU is doing. I think we have a genuine obligation towards people living here that when we talk digitalization, we also provide a good tool to use it.
Christian?
Just very briefly, conscious of time, I would rather argue the other way around and say that privacy-enhancing technologies are probably a way to address the tension that you described, because essentially it ensures basically that only the minimal amount of volume of data is what needs to flow between the countries. And so you basically, by implementing PETs, have a higher likelihood of protecting privacy, or what you call data sovereignty interests. So,
do you see PATs as a competitive advantage for different markets? Or are we already on the path that it's all about data maximization?
No, I think that indeed, I mean, this is, I think what we have been talking about so far, indeed, that it shows that privacy-enhancing technology can be a way to basically do data-related businesses in a smarter way. Because you basically don't have to collect as much, and you don't have to send and transfer as much data, but you can really implement the data minimization principle in a way that is most effective, to be short.
Closing remark from you, Sarah?
I would just agree with that. I think pets can be a competitive advantage for an individual company, an organization, or a government. As I said earlier, like we saw with AI, the countries that invested in that got a competitive advantage, right, and are reaping the benefits of now. If you invest in pets, you're going to have those same competitive advantages and get the full promise of AI with all the protections that we want. So I agree. So let's get to work and advance in pets.
No, just to say that we have 1 more minute, and I see a lady raising hands there. Maybe we can take her last.
Yeah, for sure. That's the final question from the audience.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you also for this talk. I'm Bibi, I'm with Freedom Internet, and I'm one of these small companies. And privacy, and therefore security and therefore privacy, I think is our unique selling point. And I think there are many local companies who offer services. They are already also, I think, meeting certain criteria with regards to privacy. And their business model is not extracting and selling data or using users, but offering a service and asking for compensation. So in that regard, I wonder how we considered that, and also considered the fact that we, or at least we as a small company, don't really stand a chance against larger companies. And also, we have no money and a seat at the table to decide what the rules and the criteria are. So, are there any tips by the large companies, for example? What am I doing wrong? Or how can we make this different, better, make sure there are actually alternatives?
I would push back on the idea that you don't stand a chance. I think if we're all doing our job right, you stand a very, very good chance. I think it's incredibly important that we look at this as a whole of government, whole of industry perspective. I think if you only focus on one sector or one type of company, we will not achieve the full promise of pets, and we do a disservice to all of us and all of our citizens. I think that's why multi-stakeholder fora are so critical. So when the governments are taking action on funding or policies or regulatory incentives, those should be open for comment and consideration. There should be more seats at the table. We should take a very comprehensive view, because I think that's the only way that we're gonna get this right, is when we take in the different use cases, the different companies, the different modalities, the different risks, and the different users, right, and the priorities that they have. So I would hope that the premise of your question is not right, that you don't stand a chance. I would hope that you do. Our success is largely tied to our developer community that we support through Play or YouTube or different platforms. And so that's why it's really important for us to continue to open source our knowledge and our tools. We want everyone to benefit and leverage the investments that we've already had to make. You don't have to reinvent federated learning. We invented it. It's out there for people to contribute to. You can take it and make it work for your purposes free of charge. And so I think that's why open source is important. That's why multi-stakeholder collaboration is important. And a really comprehensive, holistic view is important.
15 seconds for Christian and then 15 seconds for Valda.
Thank you. Building on what Sarah just said, I would also nevertheless want to acknowledge the difficulty, because I think what we are facing in society is the need to maybe also rethink alternative business models. Because it's true that the dominant business model when it comes to data, tend to be about collect as much as you can and target the individuals and leverage value. But as we also acknowledge, privacy-enhancing technology gives us a possibility, and we haven't yet discovered all range of possible promising business model yet.
And just to finish off, I think Commission is very much aware that privacy-enhancing technology is there to enhance privacy and not to enhance businesses. And I think this tension is very much real, and we are very much aware and looking into those things. Thank you.
Thank you, Freedom Internet, for the question. Thank you, Valda. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Christian. It's time for coffee. Thank you very much.